Hey everyone, welcome to D-Squared Stories, a weekly audio fiction podcast that brings you short serialized weekly stories. Our inaugural story this week is called Lottocracy. It is the story of a fictional country of Ispia that selects all of their government officials via a random selection process called the sortition. Our story follows Dominic Donovan, a man selected for leadership in the Ispian government, as he is whisked from his regular life into the chaos that can only come from a government picked by complete random chance. This will be a 5-part series with new chapters dropping every Monday, so be sure to subscribe on your podcast app of choice to get updates on new chapters as they come out. One last thing before we get into it, if you like what you listened to today, please rate on podcast app of your choice, comment, subscribe if you're listening on YouTube. I know you probably hear this on every single video podcast you listen to, but this stuff really goes a long way. It also helps me understand that you like what's being put out. Also, if you have any nerd friends like myself who would appreciate a political dramedy with an occasional statistics joke slipped in, any of the 5 of them on Earth, I assume, please share this with them. Okay, obligatory call to action over. Without further ado, let's get into Chapter 1 of Lottocracy. Chapter 1, The Sortition. Ladies and gentlemen, friends and countrymen, those are the results of the sortition for your Ispian senators. Now it is time for the moment we have all been waiting for, the selection of our 3 co-governors. The little voice boomed even through my television at a low volume as I continued picking at what fruit was left on my plate. My wife, Vicky, shook her head as she picked up her breakfast plate and my empty coffee cup and took it back into the kitchen. "I don't know why you watch this, Dom," she said. "It's not even like the results ever really matter." She paused and looked at me disapprovingly while waiting for an answer. I finished chewing and swallowing the strawberry I was working on before I answered. "It matters," I said, more defensively than I meant to. "The last change in the House let them pass that 5% tax increase the Senate had been pushing for years." She had hardly waited for me to finish babbling before she went into the kitchen. She gently placed the plate in the kitchen sink, and I could hear her pouring some more coffee for me. She was not political. Most people were not these days. They hardly followed the news because there was little they could do to change it. I was the odd one out in that regard, who still followed politics religiously. It confounded her, but she was normally understanding of it. I smirked a little and cracked back. "We at least have to watch this. They could pull one of our names," I said. There was no verbal response. The only sound was the coffee pouring into the cup, but I knew without a doubt her eyes were rolling. I said that every year, half as a joke, half because it could be true. I turned back to the TV as the round, excitable man carried over the piece of paper back to the microphone. "Here it is, my fellow Ispians. Your co-governors for the year 3024 are..." An incredibly unnecessary drumroll played behind him as he tried his best to hype up the crowd, which was mostly filled with bureaucrats who had seen this all before. "Megan Hoffman of the little farm town of Doreen. Matt Jansen of our own capital city here in Ispis. And not too far from that, from a suburb called Rockwell, our last co-governor is Dominic Donovan." The sound of a coffee mug hitting the counter rang out. This was as clear a sign that Vicky had heard the TV. This was good, because I needed proof that I did not hallucinate it, and my jaw was too agape to let her know what happened. She re-entered the room, looking for some kind of sign she had misheard. But the look on my face and the names presented on the TV chyrons left no doubt. We turned to each other and simply looked dumbstruck for several minutes. The entire week leading up to when I had to report to Ispis was mostly a blur. It was just too many conversations with people I had hardly heard from in years. Each one of them was all too ready to tell me what I needed to do while in office. It was interesting. The same people who had no care for politics suddenly had a lot of opinions to share with me. Vicky went through a number of emotional cycles, and the worst of those had her insist that I had to turn the position down. She would fight with me for a night over it, but when she awoke in the next morning, she would apologize and agree that we had no extenuating circumstances to allow us to challenge the sortition. "Good luck today, dear," she said. She kissed me as I got out of the car and onto the platform for the train into the city. "Thanks, I'll do my best," I said, feeling dumb almost immediately for that choice of words. I got aboard the train and tried to sit in the furthest out-of-the-way spot that I could. I sat my briefcase down on my lap and adjusted my tie. It felt so awkward wearing these after years of a more casual life running the cafe with Vicky and whatever clothes I felt like wearing. I scanned people's faces and I think I got lucky because no one seemed to recognize me. I settled in for a short train ride into the city. The tall buildings painted against beautiful park landscape along the lake did make the ride in quite beautiful. I had been in the city here and there for fun, but it felt so much more daunting today than it ever did before. This was especially true for the Capitol Rotunda, my destination. which seemed to sit imposingly on top of the hill just beyond the lake. The stop for the rotunda happened to be the last stop on this train, which worked out for me not to have to take any other connections in the city. When I emerged and started towards the stairs for the main building, my prized anonymity disappeared. I was suddenly engulfed in a sea of people with cameras and microphones, each of them asking a flurry of questions that it was almost impossible to tell who was saying what. "Sir Governor, the economy has been increasingly stagnant since the tax bill 2 years ago. Will you keep the status quo or repeal the increase?" one woman asked. "What do you have to say about those who are already concerned about the favoritism you might have for coffee farmers due to your business ties?" a man asked. "Dominic, Dom, it's ISP News. Which celebrity hottie among the Corrada sisters is your fave queen? Are you more of a Corinna guy or more into Cayenne?" I probably failed to disguise my confusion as I stared at the young man with long, wavy blonde hair and sunglasses who put together what I think was a string of words, despite my complete incomprehension as to what they meant. I was feeling quite overwhelmed when an older man in a blue uniform and 2 deputies of his quickly shooed everyone away from the area with a sense of authority. "All right, you vultures," he said gruffly, but without any malice. "Get back. You'll have plenty of time to ask all your questions at the press meeting." He firmly grabbed me by the arm and started walking me up the stairs while his 2 deputies kept the reporters at bay. He let out a deep sigh when it was just the 2 of us. "Son, this is why we insisted on having an escort vehicle take you up here today. That could have been worse if someone wanted to harm you. Please do not fight us on this going forward." I was a little taken aback at how stern and scolding he had suddenly become out of the public eye. Nonetheless, I continued going up the stairs with him until we reached the excitable round man I had seen announce my name on the TV just a week ago. He seemed unable to contain his excitement from far away, but his expression changed to disapproval when he saw the way I was being dragged up the stairs. "Chief Gammon," he said, his voice dripping with frustration he failed to hide, "could you please release the arm of dear Co-Governor Donovan?" "Sure thing, Mr. Wong," he said, releasing me. "I was just making sure our co-governor made it up here all right." Mr. Wong, who I knew by the name Alfred Wong, seemed to lighten up as I got my agency back. He seemed to point a finger down the hall, which took me a moment to realize it was an instruction for me to walk with him as he took off that way. I quickly caught up with him, and also noticed that the chief, who I assumed was the chief of Capitol Security here, tailed behind us. "So good to meet you, Co-Governor. We have just about everyone here already, so we'll be able to start the assembly. I hope you're as excited as I am for you to get started on your first day of session," he said. I laughed a little. "Mr. Wong." He interrupted me almost immediately. "Oh no, please call me Alf. I want all the selected officials to feel like they can be very informal with me. I am here to serve at your pleasure." I tried not to roll my eyes at the phrase selected officials. The term that people used, at least out in the suburbs, were unlucky winners. This was a reference to the lottery system that our whole Lottocratic system drew its inspiration from. That was part of the basis, and the other part was that few people really wanted to lead in this often chaotic and frozen government. "Understood, Alf," I said. "But I was going to say, I don't think there's anyone quite as excited as the first day of session as you are." He simply smiled at this and continued to pick up his pace as we went into the assembly hall on the House floor. Upon a glance, I quickly noticed the new House members on one side of the aisle and the senators, far fewer in number, on the other side. Towards the back, there were many people I could pick out as staffers, lifers, who would be here longer than any of us would be. The bureaucracy was essential to the Lottocracy, because with people changing constantly, someone had to know how to actually write a law in this building. I was directed towards the center of the chamber, in a third chair next to a woman a few years older than me and a man a good bit younger than me. The young man rose to meet me as Mr. Wong took his place at the podium and prepared his talking points. "Hey, I'm Matt Jansen. You must be our other co-governor," he said. He gripped my hand and gave me a genuinely enthusiastic smile. He had deep brown eyes, just a fair bit lighter than the tone of his skin. I almost did a double take looking at him so closely. I could swear he was no older than 25, which was the minimum age you had to be in order to be eligible to be selected by the sortition. However, he carried himself as if having years of experience doing this. "Nice to meet you, Matt," I said. "I'm Dominic Donovan." His eyes lit up. "Ah, yes, that's right. That was your name. D-squared. Over here is Mrs. Megan Hoffman." She had bright blue eyes and rather fair but heavily freckled skin. She looked like a woman who was no stranger to hard work, though she seemed notably out of place here. Whereas most people here wore suits and professional attire, she wore a plaid dress, almost seemingly with a design stolen from a farmer's wife in a children's book. "Hello there, Mr. Donovan," she said softly. "Nice to meet you, Mrs. Hoffman," I said. The contrasting nature of Matt's absolute informality with Mrs. Hoffman's reserved introduction took me on a bit of a roller coaster, and I think opened up a window into exactly what I should expect for the next 4 years, if I make it that long. Mr. Wong finally finished rustling with his papers at the podium and began his speech. Welcome all, selectees of the Ispian government. We hope you are so excited for this next chapter of the story of our nation, he said, proudly looking over the audience. It is my honor as the facilitating chairman of the Senate to welcome you all into the hallowed halls of our government building. I scanned the faces of the attendees, and if expressions were colors, I would be looking at a rainbow of every shade from disinterested and annoyed all the way to ecstatic and focused. Some were ready to take notes, some were not so inconspicuously on their phones, and some of them looked plain confused to be here. I related most to the latter. We wanted to do a brief introduction. My name is Alfred Wong, but you can call me Alf. I have served as the facilitating chairman of the Senate for the past 15 years, since I took over from my late father, who served as the first chairman of the Senate at the very beginning of this great Lottocratic experiment. I had never really thought about it, but he had been serving nearly as long as I was around to remember politics, and his father before him. Lottocracy was quite an experiment, and yet for all its randomness, it seems even it was not fully immune from nepotism. I'm sure many of you have met Chief Gammon on your way in, and hopefully many of you have had the chance to meet Isabella Reyes, our noble facilitating chairwoman of the House. He pointed over to Gammon, who seemed indifferent to even acknowledge he was named. Meanwhile, the woman next to him, a rather short middle-aged woman with dyed orange hair, jittered as she waved excitedly at the audience. The coffee cup in her hand I assumed was not her first of the day, based on her movements. We, in addition to all the staffers you see behind you, serve at the pleasure of the House, Senate, and governorship. Please ask us at any time if you need anything, or feel free to vote us loose if you are not satisfied with our work. That is in your right as our selected officials, and that is the way of our Lottocracy. He spoke emphatically, as if this form of government was like a higher power to him. I could imagine him at night kneeling by his bedside and saying a series of prayers to the algorithm that randomly selected the people to run the country every 2 years. The thought almost made me laugh, and I brought a hand to my face and pretended to cough. As per our glorious Constitution, our floor rules have reset to their original state. Please take careful note of these, because they must be followed up until the point you have a chance to change them, which you may. After all, that is the way of our Lottocracy. I felt like I was watching a record player skip for a moment, but hastily pulled out a pad and pen. This was probably going to be the only beneficial thing said to me today. The rules have been simplified over the years, he said, but even still, the exact order and procedure of debate is excruciatingly important, and we may need to take over an hour here to discuss all the intricacies of how bills are brought to the floor, how amendments are added, and how the speaking order works. Nothing going forward is going to make sense if you don't understand the rules. Let's start with quorum. I zoned out a little bit at this point and had to get a summary from someone else after. Essentially, in each chamber, it went down a speaker's list, in alphabetical order, to introduce bills onto the floor. Then each member had a minute speech to debate, but could pass if they wanted to. There was a break for unmoderated debate in the middle, but with how many people opted to pass regularly, they often got to vote on a handful of bills a day. The quality of those bills, due to the process of just pumping them out, was often questionable, and both chambers had a majority of bills fail to make it through. I hope that makes sense, he continued. Everything we do is centered around these rules for now, even the motions we have to go through to change them. Any questions? A gentleman in a rather shoddy suit raised his hand. I squinted a little bit as Isabella ran the microphone closer to him, and he stood in the aisle. Yeah, so one quick clarification question, he said. If a bill is overriding a veto of all 3 co-governors, it only needs 75% in one chamber and only 2/3 in the other, and it doesn't matter which one? Yes, that's correct, Mr. Wong said. I looked at the representative before finally clicking that it was the ISP news reporter who accosted me earlier. At the same time, Chief Gammon must have made the same realization, because he ran over and started barking. Hey, what the hell? He said. Weren't you the reporter harassing people with inane questions about celebrities outside the rotunda? Yeah? He said. Per the bylaws and the intro package we received, we're allowed to have part-time employment outside of the government as long as we guarantee no conflict of interest on the inside. So out there, I'm going to be getting the hottest scoop and takes, but in here, I'm going to be passing hotter legislation. Matt was unable to stop himself from laughing in the seat next to me, which I was glad for because otherwise it was going to be me. I guess people really do contain multitudes after all. Chief Gammon looked to be absolutely furious, but Wong only seemed perplexed by the situation and shuffled his papers on the podium. You were right, Wong started. Representative, Balsa would, the man stated. Unbelievable! Is this some sort of joke to you? Gammon yelled. A guard of his got between the chief and the representative, but almost needed to push back on the chief to make him keep his distance. My dad was a balsa, my mom was a Wood, the Honorable Representative Balsawood explained. They both decided to hyphenate for our family name. It's 3024 after all. Chief Gammon, clearly seeing his subordinates had no intention of letting him rip out the representative's spinal cord in front of the entire legislature, stomped off and fumed back to the corner where he was originally stationed. Wong simply adjusted some papers on his desk, a tic he seemed to have when he needed to reset and create a sense of order. Nothing in the proceedings following was all that interesting. Many people had questions about some of the nitty-gritty floor procedure. But again, like I was under some sort of spell, I seemed to zone out nearly automatically for that information. "All right," Wong said proudly. "With no further questions, we will sequester each of the chambers to have a short 45-minute mixer with their peers. Then we will all meet in the cafeteria for lunch and get on our way to start business." I followed Matt and Megan, who were being led by Chief Gammon to the office of the co-governors. Right as I was about to reach the door, I felt a light pull on my shoulder. I turned around and saw Isabella looking up at me. She seemed even shorter up close, possibly only an inch or two over 5 feet. She still had her coffee cup clutched tightly in her hand. "Hey there, Co-Governor Donovan," she said. "Didn't get a chance to introduce myself before the assembly, but I'm Isabella Reyes. I am the proud servant of the House Chamber and right-hand woman to Mr. Wong." She smiled and seemed to jitter with levels of caffeine befitting a person who had to oversee 300 randomly selected people who cycled through every 2 years. "Nice to meet you, Isabella," I said. "It seems like you have a lot on your plate with all this." She laughed too much at what really was not a joke. "Oh, it's nothing. I got it all under control. And really, while my primary responsibility is the house, I try to make sure I help take care of everyone running things around here. If there's anything at all you need, I'm your gal." She tucked her folders beneath her arm with her coffee and shot me a finger gun. It would have been almost awkward to the point of wincing if it were not for the fact that it seemed so genuinely and unironically earnest. "Right. I will certainly take you up on that if I need it." She smiled and took off with a brisk pace across the hall towards the House chamber. I could not help but smirk to myself. I entered the door to my new shared office. Matt and Megan were sitting on opposite chairs and seemed to be chatting. Matt looked a little relieved to see me enter, as if I was saving him from a conversation that he either needed to awkwardly end or extend by talking about the weather. "D squared," he said. "You got lost down that hallway? Mrs. Hoffman and I were just chatting about where we were from. She's from this town all the way on the coast called Doreen. You ever been?" "Can't say that I have," I said. "I grew up in the suburbs around Ispia and about an hour out, and honestly I don't often get more than 2 hours away from the city." "Oh, you really should, Mr. Donovan," she said. "The suburbs are little quaint places, but they really are nothing compared to the good old Ispian countryside." I noticed Matt turn his face and roll his eyes a bit. "I've been out there. Too quiet for my tastes." Megan seemed to scowl a bit at this. I quickly got the sense that these two had plenty of time to get to know each other before I arrived at the rotunda, and it was not going well at all. I took control of the conversation and tried to lead it towards non-controversial topics, like how we plan to split up our responsibilities. Matt wanted to take on more of the public-facing duties: ribbon cuttings, speeches, charity outreach, and activism. Megan had a somewhat surprising interest in a plan to overhaul the rules of debate, and would likely find most of her time spent whipping votes early on to make it happen. That did unfortunately leave me with a lot of facilitation and mediation between factions of the chambers, which no doubt would shortly form. It was by no means ideal, but I preferred it greatly to the weight of being in the public eye constantly, and the headache-inducing tedium of writing parliamentary procedure with staffers. I got the sense that both Megan and Matt liked this compromise because it would put me in charge of mediating politically thorny issues, and they both felt like they would be able to sway me of their leanings much more than they would the other. The imminent dread I felt anticipating those tough conversations was something I tried to avoid thinking about too much. The 45 minutes went by much faster than I thought they would, and we were suddenly being escorted to the cafeteria with all the other members. There was a fully staffed kitchen with more options than I could have ever imagined. The intersections of the interests of the randomly selected officials and the staffers who worked there and did most of the work full-time met at the Capitol facilities. No expense was spared on the food or on the athletic facilities on site, so I was told. My eyes scanned for a spot to sit down with my delicious-looking seafood paella when I saw a woman at a small table wave me over to her. "Co-Governor Donovan, nice to meet you," she said. "I'm Representative Lisa Fay of the House." Lisa was a woman with short black hair, glasses, who looked to be normal height, but probably stood deceptively taller with her high heels. She was fully decked out with a black blazer over top of a blue-collared shirt. She wore a pin with the Ispian flag on her blazer. In a room full of people who did not look the part of statespeople, she almost seemed out of place for how much she did belong. "Nice to meet you, Lisa. Please, just call me Dominic," I said. "Ah, still not comfortable with the title, are you?" she asked. Her words sounded a little teasing, but her expression conveyed that she did seem genuinely interested in knowing the answer. "No, not really," I said. "You, on the other hand, look like you've been dreaming about this since you were a little girl." This made her smile. "You're exactly right. I've always wanted to be in government. I think there's just so much the government can do to help people if it's run right, but no one these days seems to care." "I think you're right, but it's hard to make real changes when a new slate of completely random people gets picked every few years." She stared intently at me, as if trying to read me. There was something admirable about just how seriously she took all of this. "We have to try, though," she said, still with fire in her eyes, "and I'm hoping you're someone I can count on to try with me these next 2 years." "Sure, Lisa, you can count on me," I said. This seemed to make her very happy. We were shortly joined by a senator from a suburb neighboring mine, and the conversation shifted to much more idle chit-chat, small talk about where we grew up, and how often we made our way to the capital city. Time seemed to be speeding by, and the next thing on our agenda was to make arrangements for the time that we would stay here. For some of the representatives and senators representing districts and regions far from the capital, their train ride was well over 3 hours one way, assuming there was even a train line easily accessible for them to get to. My commute was so short, so I was hoping to just continue going back and forth from Rockwell. I was headed in the opposite direction as most of the officials when I heard Chief Gammon call out to me. "Co-governor, a moment if you will," he said, very formally and uncharacteristically politely. I turned to the right. He was standing right next to me, and I had hardly noticed. "Ah, you spooked me a bit. What can I do for you, Chief?" I asked. "Yes, your subpar spatial awareness is somewhat related to our topic of conversation." I frowned. I never really thought of myself as lacking spatial awareness. He continued. "I just wanted to let you know I took the liberty of reserving and arranging a stay in the governor's complex for you and your counterparts," he said, quickly going to his next statement before I could respond. "I know you expressed disinterest in this, but I must insist that you reconsider. I also must insist that you reconsider having a security detail." He must have seen my face curling with frustration the way he picked up the pace of his voice to avoid allowing me to protest. "Chief Gammon, I really appreciate your concern, I do," I said, trying to match his attempt at politeness. "But my wife is running the cafe that we spent years building up. She can't be here full-time, and I'm not about to see her only once every few weeks, surrounded by complete strangers who follow me everywhere." Gammon looked ready to retort, but I borrowed his playbook and just kept talking. "Since the introduction of the sortition, there's never been a single member of the Ispian government assassinated, kidnapped, and even them being threatened is rare," I said. "There's no use to it at all. People are disengaged from the process." "You misunderstand," the chief said. "There's never been a viable threat since our Lottocracy started, because since our Lottocracy started, I've been involved in its security, first as deputy chief, and now as our government's lead defender himself. You are not the first stubborn official I've dealt with, but you will by no means be the first to besmirch my record." His face hardened briefly and then seemed to turn to regret. He had clearly been trying to hold back his temper in an attempt to persuade me, but it was to no avail. I simply let out a sigh and continued going to walk past him. "Again, Chief, I appreciate your concern, but I think we're just going to have to accept we don't see eye to eye on this." I found myself somewhat surprised that he made no attempt to block my path, or say anything to try and make me turn around. He remained completely silent, and the sounds of the crowds of people slowly making their way by us were clearer. As I walked, I noticed a man who had been waiting by the hallway that I had not noticed before start to approach me. I did not recognize him, but I had to assume he was just one of the representatives I had not met yet, looking to snag a quick introduction with me. That was what I thought, up until I saw him pull the kitchen knife from his sleeve. His walk turned into a sprint as he ran towards me. I found myself freeze up and go completely wide-eyed as he charged at me and yelled out at me. "Die, you filthy lottocrat!" he yelled. As he got up to me, I thought I was at the end of my life. That was when Gammon swiftly stepped in and, despite his age, seemingly effortlessly grabbed the man. He grabbed the wrist holding the knife, and his other arm went low to his waist. Gammon lifted the man overhead and tossed him across the room with great strength, sending him onto his back. The man looked shocked as he winced in pain. "Ow, damn it, what the hell?" he groaned with pain. Gammon pulled his radio to his face. "Armed assailant in the cafeteria, requesting backup. He is a young male, blonde hair. He's reaching for his weapon." I watched as Gammon lied into the radio and pulled his gun from his hip. The man's eyes widened in fear. "Wait, no, you said—" Gammon fired 5 shots at the man, most going into his chest but one hitting him straight in the head, presumably killing him instantly as I watched him drop lifelessly to the floor. My mouth hung agape as I stared at him. I was more shocked and frozen than before. In mere moments, the security details nearby descended on the scene. They grabbed me by the arms. Find the other two and take them to the governor's complex and put them under lockdown until further notice, Gammon said to them. I'll start a search of the perimeter for anyone who shouldn't be here. We have no way of knowing if this assailant was acting alone and must take emergency protocols until we do. Gammon's men started to drag me off in the direction of the complex. As they did this, I stared at the chief as he instructed his men on the search. He seemed so methodical, so rehearsed. The only parts of him that seemed to not be acting as a part of this grand performance were his eyes. I could ever so slightly catch him glancing at me as I got pulled off the premises. The Lottocracy might be random, but nothing about what just happened was. Thank you so much for listening to this chapter of Lottocracy. If you enjoyed, please rate the podcast on the app, give it a like on YouTube, and share with anyone who you think might also enjoy. Lottocracy is a D2 Stories production. You can stay up to date with Lottocracy and all future D2 Stories productions by following us on social media. That'll be D2 Stories across just about any of the big platforms. I appreciate you listening and hope to have you listen again next week.